Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger. Welcome to our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. It's June 30th, 2022, and Helga, as NATO was meeting to plan a bigger war in Europe, and as the effects of inflation and the economic breakdown are immiserating billions of people, the Schiller Institute has launched a mobilization around a call for an ad hoc committee for a new Bretton Woods. This grew out of a dialogue from recent Schiller Institute conferences, and I'd like to begin by asking you, what is your intent in initiating this call?
Well, there are many people who are extremely concerned about the danger of a third world war. And given the fact that this danger is increasing really by the day, as we just could see by this recent NATO meeting in Madrid, but most people just are against the war, but they're not really looking at what is the cause for this increased war danger. And it is the fact that the neoliberal system is collapsing. As a matter of fact, it has been collapsing for a very long time, but now it has entered its final hyperinflationary phase, and the entire transatlantic sector is comparable in the situation with Weimar Germany in the summer of 1923. Now, that is why we need to take action before you have either hyperinflationary blowout of the system, or if the central banks are increasing the interest rates, you could have a chain reaction collapse, and that would increase the war danger dramatically. So therefore, we are calling for a new Bretton Woods system, a committee to organize such a system, which must take immediate emergency measures to completely reorganize this bankrupt transatlantic neoliberal system. And given the fact that there is a historic precedence which can be used, we are calling it a new Bretton Woods system, because if you go to the initial intention of Franklin D. Roosevelt, what he wanted the Bretton Woods system to become, which it never unfortunately did because he died, and then Churchill and Truman designed the Bretton Woods, which is why many people think it was not such a great thing. But if you look at the intent of Roosevelt, he wanted to create a credit system which would overcome colonialism and end the poverty in the third world by increasing the living standard, especially of the developing countries. Now, this is urgently needed because we have 1.7 billion people who are in danger of starvation. We have still 2 billion people without clean water. And I could add that there is no modern health system in most countries, and so forth and so on. So what we need is an immediate declaration of bankruptcy of this present system and replace it with a new one, starting with a global Glass-Steagall banking separation, to get rid of the derivatives once and for all, get rid of speculation in fuel and food, because that's totally immoral and should not happen. And then you need a national bank in every single country to bring the power of credit generation back under sovereign governments. Then you need a connection between these national banks for an agreement for long-term investments with low interest rate and long duration, so that real development can take place in the developing sector. Now, that is highly feasible. It is what is the wish of the majority of the population who are in urgent need for such a change. And that is why we have launched this call for a new Bretton Woods system. And I'm calling on all of you to sign it, to circulate it widely, and create the condition for a new world economic order, which is just and allows for the survival and well-being of all people living on this planet.
We'll have a link for the petition to this call at the bottom of the description section of this video. Now, while you're putting forward this idea of real transformation, we saw the G7 meeting in the mountains in a complete fantasy state, presenting ideas for more war and more consolidation by the global bankers. What do you make of this G7 meeting?
Well, if it would not be so sad, it would be ridiculous, because what these leaders, in quote, portrayed was, that they really are only concerned about themselves, that they have a completely Eurocentric view of the world, and that was not changed by the fact that they invited the 5 leaders of the countries of the developing sector who had refused to join in the condemnation of Russia. They did not let themselves be pulled in the camp of the so-called democracies. I mean, what they came up with are proposals which are, utterly useless. For example, they want to counter this new Silk Road by China by creating their own Silk Road. They have planned 600 billion over 5 years to be spent on that. But all of that, or most of that money, is supposed to come from private investments, which means it will go the way how any other proposal by the EU ended in the last years. It will basically go nowhere. But I think most important is really the absolute, misunderstanding of what are the requirements in the world. And if there would have been a real leadership, even Oxfam from the British institution, they blasted the fact that the G7, in light of this incredible pandemic and world hunger, only came up with a meager 4.5 billion to address the biggest world famine, since a very, very long time, which is utterly peanuts. Oxfam says they would have needed at least 28.5 billion, but even that falls much short. We have put out a program a while ago where we said we have to, in light of this hunger crisis, we have to double the food production, which could be done if the governments would give credits, and put, especially in Europe and the United States, all these ridiculous set aside programs, farm to fork, not using 30% of the territory for agricultural production. That all should be thrown out of the window. Credits should be given so that the farmers have access to. Now it's already in the mid of the summer, but that is what we demanded in the spring. That farmers have access, to fertilizer, to pesticides, to seeds. That can now be done in the southern hemisphere, and then next season it must be done in the northern hemisphere. Nothing of this was done. No banning of biofuel, no taxation of excess profits from speculation in food and fuel, and no moratorium on the debt of the developing countries. I mean, they have just fallen completely short of taking the kind of responsible leadership which would have qualified them to represent the world. So they are not. They're just a has-been group. And I think the Chinese Foreign Ministry said it quite correctly, that the G7 represent 777 million people, but the BRICS, which just took that meeting just took place also, they represent 3.2 billion people. So the weight of these people is greatly diminished, and they should really reflect and review why their system is failing, rather than being so arrogant and trying that they run the world from the top of the Olymp.
I'm not sure they're capable of reflection, but in the meantime, we're seeing different things occurring around the world that are breaking with that. And by the way, the $600 billion fund, as you mentioned, it's mostly private, but it's unlikely that countries will see any of that except in the form of maybe some solar panels and a few batteries. Now, as you mentioned, while this was going on, the BRICS were meeting, the BRICS-Plus, which had a completely different conception of what needs to be done. What's your sense of the mobilization coming out of the BRICS conference?
Well, I think it was an extraordinary meeting. all the leaders who spoke expressed concern for the well-being of humanity as a whole. And, as a result, it's an institution which is growing. Now Iran and Argentina applied formally for membership, and others were guests and are basically intending to join in the future. So I think this is a completely different organization, which is based on a win-win cooperation idea. It's based on, overcoming poverty, overcoming underdevelopment, and the best the G7 could do would be to dissolve and cooperate with the BRICS countries. That would make much more sense.
And also, there was a very interesting comment from Sergei Glaziev, who's involved with the Eurasian Economic Commission, where he spoke about your husband as the deepest thinker of the last 25 years, and talked about Lin's development conception, which is very much along the lines of what you're calling for in this conference, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, we know Mr. Glaziev since quite some time. He for sure is the best economist of Russia. He's also convinced that Russia would do very well if it would adopt the Chinese model of economy. But it seems that the response of not only Russia but many of the Asian countries and some others is to go in the direction of the kind of physical economy which my husband was a real very, very good expert on. And I think there is clearly an affinity. So I'm very happy about the statement by Mr. Glaziev, naturally.
Now, of course, then we have to pick up what came out of this NATO summit, where, again, more war, expansion of NATO. I mean, given that the current war in Ukraine was the result of NATO expansion, how does it make sense to do more expansion if you want to stop war?
Well, this NATO summit was really terrible. Unfortunately, we saw it coming for a long time, but they went really for a complete break with relations with Russia. They put out a new security paper in which Russia is described as a clear and present threat. China is characterized as a multifaceted challenge, but they intend to expand NATO globally, with other words, making it really a world government which basically will challenge Russia and challenge the rise of China, which, if that policy is pursued, has the potential of leading to World War III, because there is no way how you can stop the rise of China in a peaceful way. China is a country of 1.4 billion people. They have the right economic policy, which is proven by the enormous number of people they lifted from poverty. And now that Chinese model is being, sort of hold out there for other countries to imitate. So, I think this idea of a global NATO is really, really bad. What does the Indo-Pacific have to do with the defense of the northern Atlantic? Nothing. Now, it is a fact that that idea of world government through a militarization of the world economy, through expanding NATO, that is not a new idea. I think that has been coming for a very long time. It's interesting that the Indian historian Prashad basically pointed out to exactly that NATO, that idea of global NATO has been coming for a very long time. And he cited Afghanistan and Libya, the military action or the war against these countries, as important points. And I just remembered that when basically under the guidance or ambiance of NATO, Gaddafi was killed. My late husband at that point said that signifies that they're going for World War III, that they're going for an attack on Russia and China, and that is exactly what has been playing out ever since. So then they want to upgrade Kiev, they want to, or the military of Ukraine, they want to replace the old Soviet weapons with modern NATO weapons. And then at a point where, the war in Ukraine is as good as lost. So this is really, it is really a policy which is completely backward oriented, but extremely dangerous. And I think NATO, should have been dissolved when the Warsaw Pact dissolved. And I think we should really come to that conclusion that NATO is a bad idea. And what the world needs instead is a new international security architecture which takes care of the security interest of every single country, including Russia, including China, because any other approach has the danger of escalation and World War III. So we should really discuss that and, discuss also, the combination of a new security architecture and a new Bretton Woods, because these things are all going hand in hand if you want to remedy the present crisis.
Now, a number of Russian defense and military officials have been focusing very much on the bellicose statements coming from London. And one of the most outrageous of these was General Sir Patrick Sanders, who's the new chief of the Army General Staff, who said that the British troops must be prepared to fight in Europe to take the battle to Russia. Now, while he's saying that, other British think tanks like RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, are putting out reports that Britain can't really field an army, that they don't have ammunition, they don't have an industrial base. So this seems to be precisely what your husband was talking about back in the 1980s, when he said when you choose this kind of war strategy with a neoliberal economic policy, you're going to lose both the war as well as the economy.
Well, I think it is also quite scandalous that all the European leaders, I mean, continental leaders, the Brits can say whatever they want, and they never have the courage to say that this is crazy, this is insane, and we are distancing ourselves. I mean, unfortunately, the present German government is basically like a NATO printout. You have people who are just talking as if there is no danger to the German people residing from what they're saying. But, if the British want to come and fight a war in Europe against Russia, to bring it into Russian territory, I mean, this is World War III. And any government who does not say this is insane and we want nothing to do with it is not representing the interest of the people. And unfortunately, in Germany, for example, and I guess France in a similar way, the United States for sure, a kind of militarization of the mainstream media and the talk has taken over, which should scare anybody who has an interest to live for the next several years.
And this is nonstop in terms of the media. Now, the other thing that happened this week, which probably most people in the world don't know about, is that the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, acted to shut down opposition, going beyond what he had done before, shut down opposition in Ukraine, the so-called democratic forces in Central Europe. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, Mrs. von der Leyen, who's pushing the quick access of Ukraine to the EU. I mean, this country has nothing to do with democracy or any of the other requirements it supposedly takes to become an EU member. Zelensky already banned 11 opposition parties on the 20th of March, and a countersuit has been filed. Among these 11 parties was that of Natalia Vitrenko and Volodyn Marashenko, two former members of the Rada. And they will fight this, I think, up to the Supreme Court. But there is no democracy in Ukraine at all, and that is also noteworthy. Who is silent about that?
Now, just to come back to the initiative that you've taken, I want to emphasize the point that you have a lot of pessimism in the West. Uh, the effect of the media, the effect of the war drive, the effect of the divide and conquer tactics that are being used. And part of what you're doing with this call is to try to revive the tradition of the American Revolution. And the Schiller Institute is sponsoring a conference on Sunday, this coming Sunday, where you'll be a participant. How do you see this ability to get across to the American people and the people of Western Europe the difference between the economic tradition of the American system of physical economy versus the insanity of the bubble economy, which everyone seems to be accepting?
Well, I had some discussions with economists in Europe who said, why do you say Bretton Woods? All we need is the going back to the UN Charter, the UN principles. Well, that's true. These principles are very valid and they must be upheld. But as I said before, the reason for the war danger is the final disintegration or threatening disintegration of the Western neoliberal system. And when you are in a crisis like that, it is very useful to go to a tested model in the creation of such a system. And what FDR did work. The New Deal did work, and it had nothing to do with the Green New Deal, but it was a real program of industrialization, which meant that by the end of World War II, the United States had emerged to be the strongest economic power in the world. And, that was the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which Roosevelt used, which also was the basis of the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau in the after the Second World War. That all goes back to the American system of economy, as in total contrast to the British model of economy. And it has a lot to do with that this history has been suppressed. For example, Bismarck turned under the influence of Henry C. Carey from a free trader into a total fan of the American system of economy, which is, I read about 20 biographies of Bismarck, and it was not mentioned in one. But the main economic advisor of Bismarck at that time, Wilhelm von Kardorff, who was the head of the Industry Association at that time, he wrote a beautiful little book called Gegen den Strom, against the stream, against the tendency, where he describes exactly what is the difference between the American system and the British system. The American system says that the only source of wealth is the individual creativity, which allows a society to again and again to discover principles of the physical universe. And if you translate these discoveries into scientific and technological progress, it increases the productivity in the production process, and that in turn gives you a higher living standard, longer longevity, and a prosperous society, as compared to the British system, which says buy cheap and sell expensive and make the middleman rich. As long as you control the conditions of trade, then you are running the show. And that's essentially what the IMF and the World Bank and so forth are. But I think, the Chinese model, for example, is much more based on the American system of economy, which, among other things, has to do with the fact that Benjamin Franklin was completely fascinated by Confucius, and the collaboration or inspiration between Lincoln and Sun Yat-sen is also an established fact. And Friedrich List is the most known economist inside China. I mean, this is a whole other story, but people just don't know this history, and therefore, this must be a surgical operation, because we will come, and my hunch would be that it is going to be this fall, the latest. We are going into an absolute escalation of mass unemployment, galloping inflation, and in that situation, only a total bankruptcy reorganization of that system will stop the danger. So again, please look at this call, sign it, and distribute it widely.
And it would be very useful if Americans use this coming 4th of July celebration to learn something about the actual history of the American system, which, as you pointed out, you can't get from the education system or from the media, but you can find a lot about it at the various publications associated with the LaRouche organization. So Helga, thanks for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing your comments on July 3rd.
Yes, till then.